Creepy guy in a Russian park. So, I was about 13 years old at the time. It was the end of the summer before I go out into the 8th grade. The entire summer leading up to August was mainly my parents, especially my mom, making a huge deal about getting to go to Russia and seeing our relatives, and making me and my older sister brush up on our Russian for weeks before we left. So, we had spent about 10 over 14 days, mainly in St. Petersburg. Our cousins had just left to go back home with their grandmother, so we were still there with our uncle and aunt. The entire group was me, my mother, my sister, 18 to 19 years old at the time, my uncle, and my aunt. Before we left, our mom wanted to see one of the parks there, just to walk around and enjoy some fresh air. By the time we entered the park, though, my sister and I were sick of walking, so we walked on a bit with our mom and her brother and sister-in-law, but soon sat down on a nearby bench, where we just talked and played Kick the Pigeon. Really, we were just frightening them. We didn't kick any pigeons. I wish I could describe the layout of where we were without using some kind of doodle. Behind us was this patch of forestry area. The trees, though, were starting to lose their leaves and the wither. Wrapped around the area was a walkway. In front of us was a single walkway, connected to the one our bench was on, which led to a fountain. On either side of it, from where we were sitting, there were two large hedges. One was directly in front of us. The other was on the other side of the walkway, a bit to our left. As we are talking, I noticed some people walk past, but none of them stopped near us. I am fairly sure I just saw the same guy walk back and forth several times. I squinted to see if I could make out any features, but I couldn't. I just knew it was some bald guy wearing a suit. This didn't bother me that much, though. I just assumed he was lost or something, so I continued talking to my sister. Eventually, I noticed a bald guy in a suit stand in front of the hedge, on the other side of the walkway. I assumed he was just passing through, but when I looked back, he was still just standing there, just facing the hedge. Eventually, as my sister and I go back to our Kick the Pigeon game, she gives me a disgusted look and looks over at the man and says to me, "Oh my god, is that guy peeing?" I glance over at the man and see his face. I can tell he's smiling and looking right at me. He has his wrinkly cock out, and his hand is making motions that don't suggest he's peeing. My sister then gasps and says, "Oh, he's not peeing." We sit there shocked for a second. As we see his smile grow wider, his eyes are locked on me and not my sister. I open my mouth to try and say something to him, but before I can, my sister stands up and begins screaming at him in English. "You fucking sicko, what the fuck are you doing in front of a child? You're sick for getting off on little boys. You disgusting piece of shit." At this point, the man begins to run into the forested area. "Yeah, you better run, you fucking coward," and hides behind one of the small withered trees, all the while smiling and laughing, like he's amused by my sister's anger. She begins to grow annoyed and shouts, "I can still see you, fucking dumbass! Get the fuck out of here!" He proceeds to laugh and hop away down the walkway, while my sister and I run to find our mom. We told her what happened, and we could still see him running. So she whistled at him and said in Russian, "Hey pervert, get over here, and show us what you have and not just my children." My sister and I were horrified at the fact that my mom thought that this shit was really funny. Our uncle just said, "Oh, they saw an exhibitionist. Was it your first time seeing one?" Then he laughed. I guess looking back on it now, it's far more humorous than it is scary. The guy was too much of a pussy to do anything to us, even though my sister and I kept looking over our shoulders just in case. He should come back. Creepy Russian guy tries to attack, runs away after I lick his hand. This happened to me when I was probably around 14 years old. I'm from Germany, and at that time was living in a small German town with approximately 6,000 residences. I had a boyfriend who was living in the same city as my school, so I would often go visit him right after school, and then in the evening would return to my home, which was about a 15-minute train ride away. It was one of those nights when I was on my way home after an afternoon spent at my boyfriend's parents' house. Because it was the end of the summertime, the sun would go down relatively late in the day. and it was still bright daylight outside when I got onto the 7:45 p.m. train from his city to my town. When the train rolled into my hometown station, however, the sun had started to set, and the light was pretty rapidly disappearing. No problem. It was only a 10-minute walk from the train station to our house, and it wasn't the first time that I had to walk home during dawn. I was the only person on the street, which makes sense, because everyone was probably watching the 8 p.m. news. But after walking a little while, I heard another person walk behind me, relatively far away from me. It was this tall, lanky guy dressed in all black, just casually strolling, seemingly coming from nowhere. I got this weird feeling in my gut right away, even though he didn't particularly look like he was following me or anything like that. At first, I tried to brush this uneasy feeling aside and tried to look extra casual, but then I remember that I learned somewhere to cross the street if you want to see if someone is following you. I crossed the street while trying to look as nonchalant as possible. He crossed it too. I walked back to the side of the street I'd originally been on. He followed my example. So yeah, the guy was definitely following me. He was also getting closer to me, but not dangerously close. I remember thinking that this street crossing trick I learned was absolutely useless, because all that changed now was that I knew for sure I was being followed, and probably the creeper knew that I knew too. Luckily, by the time I finished that thought, I had reached the bottom of the hill we lived on, so now I only had to get up that hill and walk a small distance until I could walk into our driveway with motion sensor floodlights. Lanky tall guy was still following me at a steady pace when I made it to the top of the hill, and now I could see my house. I knew I'd be safe in a few minutes. I started to walk faster and turn into our driveway. Our light turned on, and I was about to open our gate to walk to the front door when all of a sudden, this guy is right behind me. In a split second, he grabs me by my left upper arm with one hand and puts his other hand around my wide open mouth. His hand presses down on my jaw hard. He now tries to take my backpack off my shoulders to rip my jacket off of me and push me down on the ground, starting to mumble breathy Russian words. For a few minutes, I am completely in shock, just unable to move. I keep thinking, this is it. He will rape me right here, and then human traffic me. Thankfully, finally, my adrenaline is kicking in, and I try to actually fight the guy off. He's still trying to push me down, but all the leg presses at the gym paid off, and I managed to push back enough so that he can't get me down. I tried to bite him, but he is pressing so hard on my open mouth that I cannot move it, so I lick his hand, just slobber all over his palm, and it works. He lets me go, backs off of me. I turn around and look him straight in the face and start yelling, "You asshole!" He turns around and runs away from me. One of the scariest moments of my life. I was so shaken that I couldn't find my keys, and I had to ring my doorbell and couldn't even tell my mom what happened because I was sobbing so hard, plus my jaw was hurting pretty bad. We called the police, and they tell us come the next day to make a statement. Apparently this dude was pretty well known in our area to just creepily walk around and follow people. But I was the first girl he actually attacked. Infuriatingly, nothing happened to him. They told me to call them if it ever happened again. I carry pepper spray with me ever since that incident, and may or may not have been quite overzealous with using it on suspicious people. I saw that creepy Russian guy again one more time when I was walking home from a friend's house one afternoon, and I ran the other way as fast as I could until I found a nice family on an afternoon walk who escorted me home. Only now, all these years later, it's clear to me how fucked up this situation really was. I can't believe the police were so relaxed about it, and that my mom ever let me out of her sight again. A back alley encounter in Russia. Last night, I had possibly the legit, creepiest encounter of my life, bar a few happenings in the dead of night in rural England. It involves a back alley and a very strange Russian man. A little bit about me. I am 18 years old, living in St. Petersburg, and stand about 6'2". However, I am slim, at about 155, so not terrifying, but not a natural victim. My Russian is decent, but local speaking quickly is still a little difficult to understand. Now, 2 nights ago, I was going out to the nearest pub for a drink, and getting there involves going through an alley shaped like 2 L's, such that there is a point in the middle, at which you cannot be seen from either road. When I reached this point, I decided to stop for a smoke before getting to the pub. I've been through this alley several times, and it's always been very, very quiet. A man coming the other way approaches me and asks for a light. I offer it to him and he begins smoking. I naturally expect him to move off, but instead, he just stands there opposite me smoking. I assume he just wants smoking company, so I think nothing of it really. I'll do my best to describe this guy, probably around 25. He stood perhaps 5'10", but much burlier than me. His longish hair and patchy stubble sent me a weird vibe almost immediately. I didn't trust him. He wore heavy leather clothing, common, but the weirdest fucking thing by far was his boots. They have fucking spurs on them. So all in all, I'm getting the feeling that this guy is an eccentric, but that doesn't automatically mean anything. I notice after about 10 seconds of silence that this guy isn't actually smoking. He's not inhaling the smoke at all. And it occurs to me that he had trouble lighting the thing in the first place. Again, really fucking weird. But I rationalize it and assume he must just be a relatively new smoker. He strikes up conversation. Now, I'll do my best to write a transcript here, as an English speaker would say these things, but he spoke very, very strange. Something like this. "You're cool, man. We should hang out, man. I've got a bunch of cool friends I chill with. We play games and shit. You'd have fun." It strikes me as a weird opener, and I'm noping the fuck out at this point, as all these weird vibes are coming from him, and a feeling that this guy's a bit of a creeper. I reply, courteously, "Sorry, mate, got plans." He continues, "No, really, dude. You should come hang out. We have a lot of fun, a lot of fun, a lot of fun." The reception of that last bit 3 times sent shivers down my spine, and it is the bit of the brief interchange that I really remember. He's leaning in now, looking directly at me. I'm creeped out, and resolved to get the fuck out of there. It occurs to me that because of the way he approached, he is between me and the main alley. I make to move around him, but he lifts the fucking cigarette butt up, as if to burn me with it. I said to him the equivalent of, "What the fuck, mate?" Shit gets to a whole other level here. He starts speaking super fucking quickly, far too fast for me. I picked up a few things though, stuff about his friends, and a lot of swearing at me. He finished his rant with this fucking statement. "Are you a homophobe? We like to eat homophobes." He said eat. No, not kill. Eat. How the hell did it escalate to here? I don't know whether I'm going to be raped or roasted at this point. I've had enough though. He starts towards me, but I shoved him hard in the chest out of the way and booked it down the alley and out into the road. I think he followed most of the way, but when I looked back, he was walking the other direction with his head low. I was jittery as fuck for hours, and when I talked to the barman, he said that this is kind of a weird area. A lot of gay people, and a lot of gay haters. Nasty kettle of fish. This guy fucking terrified me. He singled me out in an alley, pretending to smoke in order to talk to me. Tried to invite me to something gangbang with his friends, trying to burn me with a cigarette butt, and then when I refused, he threatened to eat me. Instead, OZERI saves the day. So, this is an encounter that my mother recounted about a year ago. I remember it quite vividly only because she was pregnant with me at the time this happened. Please note, this was told to me in Russian, so there will be some rough translations. So, some setup. This takes place in Rashka, which is Russian for either Russia or the USSR, which makes Lithuania, my birthplace, a possibility as well, sometime in the mid-1986. My mother is in her mid-20s at the time, and married to my father, who was about 8 years older. The encounter started with my mother leaving a shopping center and market and hailing a taxi with the intention of heading to her friend's house. The taxi arrived, and she got into the front seat, which I was told was common practice at that place and time, and gave the driver, who she said seemed about 20 years old, the address. They drove off, and about a minute or two into the trip, the taxi driver's friend, roughly the same age as the driver, sat up in the back seat of the taxi, which was definitely not common practice. My mom was unsettled by this, and asked the driver what was going on, to which the driver replied that the stranger was his friend. Apparently, the two men were just talking amongst themselves, and they were heading towards the address that she gave the driver, so she wrote this off as the driver being a harmless idiot. This is also why she didn't demand to be let out immediately, although she was still a bit nervous. A few minutes later, the driver deviated from where he was going, and instead headed into a shadier part of the city. My mom asked something along the lines of, "Where the hell are you going?" And the driver said, "We'll be stopping by a bar first." At which point my mom became terrified and demanded to be let out of the car, to which the driver replied, "You'll get out when we let you out." They continued heading towards a club after the exchange, and my mom got much quieter due to being petrified. Meanwhile, the banter between the two men got more aggressive. At one point, the friend mentioned how much fun they'll have at the club with some not at all subtle sexual undertones. My mom just sat there listening, which is when they switched to a topic of a guy in a hospital, whose name they didn't mention. A bit of a necessary tangent. My father was not exactly a straight arrow. My mother never mentioned exactly what was going on in Russia. We moved to the US when I was about a year old, but he was likely involved in some gang and mafia activity. At the time this encounter took place, my father and his friends were talking about a rather important man in their circle named OZERI being in the hospital and was due to be released soon. My mother was familiar with the name but never met the guy. So back to the taxi, the two friends were talking about an old fart in the hospital and how nice it'd be if he stayed there and died. Suffice to say, they weren't fans of his. My mother wasn't sure who they were talking about, since they didn't mention any names, but given where they were going, the behavior of these guys, and the secrecy in which they were discussing the subject, she was reasonably certain it was OZERI, and tried using said information to get out of the mess she was in. So in the middle of their bad-mouthing the unnamed man, she turns to the driver and says, "OZERI wouldn't be very pleased to hear how you're talking about him." The half-surprised, half-terrified look that came over both of their faces confirmed her suspicions. They asked her how she knew OZERI, and she said that he and her husband were friends and business partners. This response apparently made them a few shades paler. She then said, "I suggest you take me home now," which they immediately did in dead silence, and so crisis was averted, although the encounter doesn't end there. Once my mother was dropped off, the taxi immediately sped off. Upon opening the door, she saw my father and his friend, Mark, at the table drinking beer. She mentioned that it was quite unusual for anyone to be home at that time of day. She walked in and immediately burst into tears. After regaining composure, she told my father what happened, at which point my father stayed with her, and Mark went into another room to make some calls. Roughly an hour later, some of my father's friends showed up, and everyone, including my mother, take a drive down to the club. The driver was planning on taking my mother. My dad gets out and asks my mom to point out the morons who were dumb enough to go to the club they told their almost kidnapping victim they were going to. My mom specifically mentioned that she was rather hesitant to point them out since they were young and stupid, and she knew what would happen to them. She was very happy about not telling anyone what they said about OZERI, which may have gotten them into far more serious trouble. My father, however, was insistent. She pointed them out and was driven back home by Mark immediately afterwards, who kept her company until my father got back. Upon arriving, my father simply told her, "They won't be bothering you again." And that was how her retelling ended. Oh, and she specifically stated that the two idiots got a beating, since the closing line is a bit ominous. Tales from Russia with no love. I'm a male, and am now 30 years old. My family moved to the States when I turned 14, but I grew up in Russia in a town called Kirov. It was big enough to house a full spread of criminal activity, from organized crime to cannibalistic hobos. These few stories are not tied together with anything else other than a cultural connection. Brief, absolutely true, and hopefully will give you a small glimpse of the state the country was in the 90s, right after the collapse. When I was very little, we lived in a typical Russian 5-story apartment building in a what you could be considered middle-class neighborhood. It was fairly quiet, with nothing much happening. so as kids could play outside for as long as we wanted, without adult supervision. I remember a man, living on the first floor of our building, his kitchen window overlooking the staircase, which ran out onto the sidewalk. He was probably in his mid to late 30s, always wearing a dirty wife beater, never a clean shave. Every time it seemed, as I would walk or ride my bike by his window, he would be sitting there, sometimes a glass of milk in hand. He then would jump up from his chair and begin to yell and shout as loud as he could at me, swearing, calling me names, threatening. All of this he would do with excessive violent movement and facial expressions. As a 4-year-old kid, I would just stand there in horror watching him do his crazy, murderous acting. He would fall on his elbows on the windowsill and shake his head, feverishly spitting out curses and deathly threats at me, his eyes bulging. He would punch his chest with all strength, and almost in tears of some deep rage would announce of his hatred towards me and how much he wished me dead. And if that wasn't enough, he would then pretend to be going for the door, as if finally having found the resolution to go through with it, then coming back to the window and more shouting, more threats. I just remember never being able to stand, to stay there for the horror that overtook me, and I would always run in the end, leaving the crazy man just staring at me out of his window. One day he was just gone. Disappeared. No more insane man in the window. Being a kid, I just moved on with my life and didn't think about the matter for years. Until much later I told my parents about him and what he did for the first time. The story they told me confirmed my suspicions of his true nature. Around the same time as one of the last times that I've seen him, a strange occurrence happened in our city. Body parts were found scattered throughout it, all far from each other and all belonging to one unfortunate man whose wife plotted to kill him for the sake of acquiring his apartment and belongings. Her brother happened to be the freak living downstairs, who both violently killed the husband, dismembering his body in a tub, and distributed the pieces, including the head, all throughout town. Everything led to the wife, and it didn't take her long to blame the entire adventure on her dear brother, who, to this day, is sleeping in some dark cell, far away, in the cold. When I was in 8th grade, my school started to have roof problems. It was an old building, which used to belong to some merchant who lived back in the days of the SARS, and every year, it seemed to give more and more, until it finally gave a class full of students the ceiling falling on their heads. For the time it would take to restore the building, the student body would attend classes in public school number 22. I still remember it clearly. A fortress of bad behavior bordering homicide. The students of number 22 mostly came from awful circumstances and enjoyed humiliations, severe beatings, just any kind of abuse. At the time, street fighting was also very common in the country, and fights rarely ended with just a black eye or a busted lip. Broken bones, skull fractures, comas, and death were routine. One day, as my friends and I were talking in a hallway between classes, a big, bald kid came up to us with his entourage of hopeless degenerates. He told us how they had had enough of us and were planning to beat the life of any boy of our school once classes were over. They didn't like us from the start because our school was considered preppy, and they acted as if we were intruding on their territory. They told us they were all going to be there, and it was gearing up to be a great show. We knew immediately he meant what he said, as this guy held a certain authority in that dark place, and most kids were afraid of him. He was one of those people who learned to swing at anyone who did anything as much as annoy him, and he wasn't alone. There were many of these types of people. We told our teachers what he said, and they let us go secretly 20 minutes before the class was over, the last class. My friends and I all banded together as we got dressed for the winter day outside, and left for school. The plan was to stick together and walk to the bus stop. I got on my bus and stood by the window. The route led right by the school, and I would be able to see the courtyard in front of the main entrance, and what could be happening there. As we were driving by, what I saw became etched in my mind for the rest of my life. On the white snow in the clearing, before the large doors of number 22, was an assembly of 200 to 250, mostly male figures, dressed in black colors and forming a giant circle. In the middle of the circle, I could see a fight underway, just two of them, one with his arms thrown open, as if taunting his opponent, and the other, someone who did not look like they wanted to be there. This turned out to be a big operation on their part, as it looked like we were invited to what was going to be planned. I later learned that once they found out we left early, as the final bell rang, all my classmates and I were already gone. They decided to beat on their own, and some poor kid was picked and beat so hard he ended up in an ICU. Since my school was very small in numbers, and some parents altogether decided to homeschool their kids for the time of the repairs, we would have easily been outnumbered 10 to 1. I hate to think what would have happened if our teachers did not let us out early that day. On the next day, armed security was on the school premises, and they stayed there until we were able to attend our old, but now dearly loved home of a dead merchant. Going back to a time when I was a kid, this last story is my personal claim to victory in the game of life or death, which happens to fall in our hands from time to time, for no apparent reason at all. I was maybe 9 years old at the time. We moved to a better area, more space, better location. Our apartment was on the last, 6th floor, and the last one on the landing. It was the furthest you could go from the entrance of the building, and fairly secluded as well. The staircase was also completely indoors, essentially housing anyone who entered in a climb, floor after floor, with 4 apartments to a landing. This day, I came home from school around 2 p.m. My parents were due to be back home for at least 3 hours or so, and I set about doing my usual homework, watching TV and emptying the fridge. It was around the time I settled in for an episode of Babylon 5, a plate with a bit of everything on my lap, that I heard the front doorbell ring. Now, that was very odd, as my parents both had their key, and no one else usually visited around this time of day. I went over to the front door and asked, "Who is it?" I heard a man answer back, "Hi there, I am from the electrical company. We're doing a routine check of the electric meters. May I come in and inspect yours? It'll only take a minute." I looked through the people and saw a young man, probably nearing 30 years old or so, very clean, neatly dressed, with his hair combed to the side. He even held a clipboard in his hand, with some papers attached. I was about to twist open the lock when I saw something else. Because of the fisheye view I had on the landing, I also could see a little extra to the sides. On my left, the man's right, I saw light bouncing from what looked like a sharp metal object. Then for a second I clearly saw what it was. The cutting edge of an axe. Someone was standing to the right of the door, attempting to hide from view, holding an axe. At this point, my memory gets blurry. I remember getting away from the door and creeping into my room, which was the farthest in the hallway, closing the door, and not coming out until my parents got back. The bell kept ringing for a few more minutes, and then it finally fell silent. I never told anyone about it. Until now, I guess. Now, these are my stories, and thank you to all who shared your own. I think it is important to learn of these encounters and to learn lessons from them. The supermarket guy. Here's my story. I'm currently almost 18 years old, and this happened when I was 3 or 4-year-old boy. I know that because it's one of my first memories I can recall myself having, probably because it was a pretty major event in my otherwise simple life. I was living in Moscow with my parents and my older sister. We were a pretty poor family, and I lived a very conservative lifestyle. My parents would go to work every day, and while my sister was at school, my grandparents would come over and cook for me and look after me. which is very normal for a Russian family. Back to the point, it was summer of 2001 or 2002, and my family went on our bi-weekly supermarket trip. It was a big deal, as I wasn't allowed to get out much due to the fact that we were living in a pretty rough district of Moscow. My dad was driving that day, and everything was normal when we got to the supermarket, while my mom and sister were getting all the food and other things I would normally be with them. That day, I stopped to try and read a label or something like that, and when I looked back up, I realized that my mother wasn't there. She assumed that I was still following them, while I assumed that they were taking a while picking up the groceries. My dad wasn't nearby, as I explained later. It was one of those moments which we all experience, where we lose our parents in the supermarket and start freaking out. As a toddler, I obviously started tearing up and didn't really know what to do. Then a man saw me, ran up to me and asked what was wrong. I told him that I lost my family, and he quickly asked if my mother was the blonde lady. I told him that she was, and he stretched out his hand and told me that he knew where they went. I immediately got very happy and held his hand as he walked me out of the supermarket into the car park. Despite what my parents told me about following strangers, I assumed that my mom had already bought everything and headed off back to the car. The man walked me up to his car, opened the door, and told me to climb inside. Looking back at it, that was probably the stupidest thing I ever did in my life, because I proceeded to get in the car as he shut the door. This is where my dad came into the story. When we were in the supermarket, he realized that he left a multimedia controller in the car. For those of you that this makes little sense to, this is what that means. As was common in Russia, cars at the time had the big multimedia boxes installed, and you could attach different controllers onto them, which were upgradable and gave you different functions or looked better, etc. These removable controllers were quite expensive, and thus it was extremely common for cars to be broken into in order to have them stolen. Thus, most people developed a habit of removing it and taking it with them, or at least putting it in the glove box. My dad quickly went to grab it from the car, fearing that it could be thieved. While he was in the car, he saw me walking with a stranger and immediately realized what was going on. He got out and sprinted towards us, and he got there just as the strange man closed the door with me inside the car. I'm not going to pretend that I know what happened next, or make up a Hollywood-style fistfight between my dad and the man, but all I know is that a few seconds later, my dad carried me away from the car, and I couldn't see the man anywhere in sight. It was my dad's pounding heart that made me realize what had just happened, and I started crying hysterically, and I apologized to my dad and mom, who had ran outside to look for me. I think that was the last straw for my parents. As a month or so after that, we sold our flat and lived with my grandparents, while my parents were finished buying a new flat on the opposite side of the city, in a much safer district. Parents, regardless of how smart you may think your kids are, don't leave them unattended in public places. There are some horrible people around, and not only in Moscow. And to the strange man from all those years ago, let's never, ever meet again.